Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving deep on a topic that pretty much every philosopher has thought about at some point: nominalism. Now, of course, uh, you know, uh, uh, the word itself, it's a little ambiguous. It can mean slightly different things depending on who you're talking to. So, for today's deep dive, what we're really going to be focusing on is the core idea at the heart of nominalism. That's the suspicion of anything beyond the concrete, the tangible, the particular.
Yeah. And for a philosopher, someone who really thinks about these things deeply, it's really important to realize that nominalism isn't just one single doctrine. There are actually two main streams of thought, and they're logically independent, but we kind of lump them together under the umbrella of nominalism.
Okay.
So the first, going back to medieval philosophy, is the rejection of universals.
Okay.
So the question is, are properties like redness or tallness, are they real entities? Do they exist out there in the world independent of any particular red thing or any particular tall thing?
Yeah.
This first brand of nominalism would say absolutely not. And their insight is a parsimonious one. Why, they ask, why should we populate our ontology with these abstract entities when we can just talk about concrete particulars?
Yeah. Okay, so that's that classic battle against universals. But you mentioned a second, more modern version of nominalism. What's the core worry there?
Right. The second version of nominalism really focuses on abstract objects.
Mm-hmm.
We can think about things like numbers, sets, propositions. These are generally thought of as being non-spatial, non-temporal, causally inert. And the nominalist in this camp really wants to get rid of these things from our ontology.
Yeah.
Really, this intuition often is fueled by an empiricist or naturalist bent. How can we possibly have knowledge of things that have no causal impact on us? So the motivation there is really quite different.
Yeah. So just to make sure I'm following, you could be someone who thinks that redness is just a way we describe red things. You're a nominalist about universals, but you still believe that sets, for example, are really existing abstract objects.
Absolutely. The two forms are independent. A great example is David Armstrong. He's a very strong defender of universals. He believes in properties and relations, but he also thinks that everything that exists is in space and time.
Yeah.
So that means he rejects abstract objects. He's a realist about universals, nominalist about abstracta.
So he would say that the property of being red really exists out there in the world, but the number two does not exist anywhere in space and time.
Exactly.
Interesting. And you said the reverse was possible as well.
Absolutely. Quine, at least at some point in his philosophical career, accepted sets, but he was a nominalist about universals. And his reasons were quite interesting. He thought sets were indispensable for mathematics and science, but he had worries about the identity conditions of universals and their role in logical theory. So really different motivations going on.
Yeah, okay. That clarifies the different camps a lot. So the fundamental tension, the question that we're going to be exploring in this deep dive today, the question that fuels both of these forms of nominalism is this: what does it really mean to say that everything is particular or concrete? This seems to be at the heart of the nominalist project, and why has it been so appealing to so many philosophers?
Yeah, it's really this deep-seated desire to ground our understanding of reality in the tangible, in the spatio-temporal, and the causally efficacious. And we're always, as philosophers, drawn to simplicity, explanatory power, and nominalists believe they can achieve both of those by limiting their ontological commitments. So our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack those arguments and also to look at the diverse strategies that nominalists have developed to account for aspects of reality that seem to resist this kind of reduction.
All right, well, let's get into some of the details. Let's define some terms. So when we talk about universals, what are we really referring to?
So a universal, best understood, is something that can be instantiated by multiple distinct individuals. A good example is whiteness. So many different things can be white. A piece of paper, a polar bear, snow. The realist about universals thinks that there's this one thing, this universal whiteness, that all these particulars partake in or exemplify. So it's really this idea of repeatability or shareability across different instances.
Yeah.
And relations like taller diamonds and even kinds, like being a prime number, could be thought of as universals.
Okay, so that's the realist picture. Now, when we talk about nominalists objecting to abstract objects, what is it exactly that they're rejecting? We talked about them being non-spatial, non-temporal, but what are the key takeaways of that from a philosophical perspective?
The standard definition you'll find in philosophy is something that's non-spatiotemporal, non-temporal, and causally inert. And that is indeed the target for nominalist critiques, especially those coming from an empiricist or naturalist perspective. Because as a philosopher, you think, well, if something has no causal powers, how can we possibly have knowledge of it? How can we even refer to it? It just seems very mysterious. And that really raises deep questions about justification and reference. Now, some have challenged this definition. They'll point out that things like languages or games, maybe these are abstract in some sense, but they do have a temporal dimension.
Right, they change over time.
Exactly, yeah. But for our purposes, we're going to stick with the non-spatiotemporal and causally inert conception, because that really seems to be at the heart of what the nominalist is worried about.
So it's not just that it doesn't have a physical embodiment, it's that it's not causally connected to anything in the world.
Yeah, and that creates this kind of unbridgeable gap between us and this realm of abstract objects.
And on the other side of the coin, the nominalist is going to be talking about particulars and concrete objects. What are the defining features of those?
So particulars are those fundamental individuals. They're unique entities, and you can't instantiate them, unlike a universal. So think about Socrates, or a particular electron, or even a particular moment in time. Concrete objects, on the other hand, exist in space and time, and crucially, they can engage in causal interactions. So this particular apple, the planet Jupiter, the act of you listening to this deep dive, all of those would count.
Right. Okay. So now that we've set the stage, let's get into some of the core critiques from the nominalist camp. What are the strongest philosophical arguments they have against accepting the existence of abstract objects and universals?
One of the most common arguments that they use, and one that's very powerful in philosophy generally, is Occam's razor. This is the idea that we shouldn't multiply entities beyond necessity. And nominalists will say, look, we can account for everything that needs to be explained by appealing to concrete objects and particulars. We don't need this extra layer of abstract objects or universals.
So the nominalist is going to ask the realist, why do we need this separate thing, redness? Can't we just talk about all of the different red things in the world and how they resemble one another?
Exactly. And they're going to push the realist to show why they need these extra entities. They have to really justify why they're adding this extra baggage to their theory.
Yeah.
Right? And this leads to debates about what our theories are really committed to. What are the ontological commitments of our best scientific theories, for example? And so even if concrete objects could, in principle, play the role of abstract objects, the nominalist is going to say, well, why should we prefer that more extravagant picture?
Right. And if the only reason to believe in something is that it makes your theory work better, but there's no other reason to believe in it, that's always a little suspicious.
Absolutely. It seems very ad hoc,
Yeah.
right? Just positing something to make your theory work.
Yeah. What's another major argument against abstract objects?
Another major argument that comes up all the time is the epistemological argument.
Yeah.
How can we possibly have knowledge of something that is causally inert, right? If it has no impact on the physical world and thus no way of interacting with our minds or our sense organs, how do we form beliefs about it? And this ties into the problem of reference as well. How do our thoughts and our words even latch onto these things if they're outside of space and time and have no causal powers?
It's like trying to learn about a system that you can never interact with. It just seems impossible.
Exactly. Now, this isn't universally accepted as a knockdown argument against abstract objects, but it does seem to place a burden on the proponent of abstract objects to explain how it is that we come to know about these things.
Are there any other major objections to abstract objects?
Another one that comes up sometimes is the idea that abstract objects are unintelligible. They're just not the kind of thing that we can make sense of. And this worry is sometimes connected to the thought that they don't have clear identity conditions.
Yeah.
You know, what makes one abstract object distinct from another? What makes them the things that they are? Now, this isn't a problem for all abstract objects. Sets, for example, have pretty clear identity conditions. Two sets are identical if and only if they have the same members.
Right.
But the general worry is that we can't really get a grip on what abstract objects are. And as the sources point out, even concrete objects can have problems with identity. For instance, if you think about the ship of Theseus, where you're slowly replacing all the parts, is it the same ship at the end?
Yeah.
So it's not a problem that's unique to abstract objects,
Yeah.
but it is worry that comes up a lot.
Yeah. So the unintelligibility argument isn't really specific to abstractness.
Okay, let's turn our attention to universals in particular. What are some of the key problems that philosophers raise about them?
One of the most historically famous arguments against universals is Bradley's regress. Now imagine a red apple, and it's instantiating the universal redness. Bradley said there has to be some relation there, the relation of instantiation.
Yeah.
But then he says, well, if instantiation is a relation, then it's potentially another universal.
And so then there needs to be another instantiation relation that links the apple, the redness, and that first instantiation,
Yeah.
so on. You get an infinite regress.
Infinite instantiation relations. Yeah.
Exactly. And this seems bad, right?
Yeah.
It seems to suggest there's something fundamentally incoherent about the very idea of instantiation.
It's like turtles all the way down, but instantiation relations instead.
Exactly. And the sting here is that it undermines the very thing that's supposed to connect particulars and universals.
How do realists respond to that argument?
Well, they have offered a couple of different responses. Some will just bite the bullet and say, yeah, there's an infinite regress, but it's not a vicious regress. It's just the fundamental structure of reality.
Right.
But others, like Armstrong, have argued that instantiation isn't even a relation. It's just a fundamental way of being related. It's sui generis. It's not something that itself requires a further relational link.
So they just sort of sidestep the whole thing by saying it's not a relation.
Exactly.
Okay. What are some other problems for the theory of universals?
Another set of problems arises when you think about necessary connections and shared parts.
Okay.
So think about the universals, methane and carbon. There seems to be a necessary connection there. Every methane molecule must contain carbon. But if universals are these distinct entities, how can they have these necessary connections between them? One way out might be to say that carbon is actually a part of methane, along with hydrogen and a particular bonding relation. But then we run into problems when we consider other molecules, like butane, which also contains carbon, hydrogen, and bonding relations, just in a different arrangement.
Right. So you can't just have a bag of carbon and hydrogen and then say, okay, that's methane.
Exactly. And this seems to violate the principle that no two things can be composed of exactly the same parts.
Yeah.
So structural universals, where the arrangement of the parts matters, are really a problem for realism about universals.
So what do realists say about that?
Well, some realists have said, okay, maybe they're only simple universals, and then the complexity comes in when you put those simple universals together in different ways.
Right.
But another more common response is to just accept that two things can be composed of the same parts if those parts are in different relations or have a different structure.
So like the universal for methane would include carbon and hydrogen and the particular bonding structure.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so we've seen some of the problems for both abstract objects and universals. Now let's get into the fun part, the different ways that nominalists try to get around these problems. So they want to build a picture of reality without abstract objects and universals. How do they account for properties and relations if they're not going to appeal to universals?
There are two main strategies that nominalists employ. The first is just to reject the existence of universals outright.
Okay.
The second is to say, okay, maybe there are these things that look like universals. Maybe they're properties and relations, but they're not universals. They're actually particulars or concrete objects of some kind.
Right.
And so they're going to try to paraphrase sentences that seem to commit us to universals, or they're going to try to provide an account of what makes those sentences true that doesn't appeal to universals.
Okay, so if I say, the philosopher's beard is gray, the nominalist has to find a way to explain what makes that true without appealing to some universal grayness that the beard is instantiating.
Exactly. And there are a lot of really clever solutions that philosophers have come up with. One is trope theory. And trope theory says, okay, there's no universal grayness out there in the world, but there are these particular instances of grayness, and we call those tropes. And your beard is gray because it has a particular gray trope.
So you're particularizing the property itself.
Exactly.
But then what makes all the gray tropes gray?
Right, that's the next question. And the trope theorist is going to say, well, they resemble each other. They resemble each other in a way that they don't resemble other tropes, like brown tropes. And so this resemblance relation is usually taken to be primitive. You don't have to explain it in terms of anything else. But then you might worry, okay, well, if the tropes resemble each other, is resemblance itself a universal? Or is it another trope? And if it's another trope, do those tropes resemble each other? And you get this infinite regress of resemblance.
Another infinite regress.
I know, right? It's philosophers all the way down.
Yeah.
So how do we stop this? Some trope theorists say, well, it's not a vicious regress.
Right.
The tropes are all of the same kind, even though there are infinitely many of them. Others try to block the regress by saying that resemblance isn't a trope, it's just a fundamental fact about tropes.
It just is.
It just is.
Okay, so that's tropes. What are some other strategies?
Another strategy is called predicate nominalism,
Okay.
and this says that something is, say, red, just because the predicate red applies to it. And then there's a similar view called concept nominalism, or conceptualism.
Okay.
And this says that something is red because it falls under the concept red.
Okay.
The problem with both of these is that they seem to make properties depend on language or thought.
Right, because if there were no speakers or thinkers, would there still be redness?
Exactly, and that doesn't seem quite right.
Yeah.
So then you get views like ostrich nominalism. And this view, famously associated with Queen, just says, look, there's nothing in virtue of which a thing is red. It just is red.
Okay.
And so it's kind of a minimalist view. But, a lot of philosophers think, well, that's not really explaining anything.
It just is.
It just is.
Okay, so that doesn't seem to quite cut it. What are some other strategies?
Well, there's mereological nominalism.
Okay.
This view says that a property, like redness, is just the aggregate of all the red things in the universe. So to be red is to be a part of that aggregate. The problem with this is that it doesn't work for a lot of properties. Think about the property being square. It's not the case that every part of a square thing is itself square.
Right. You could have a collection of water molecules, but that doesn't mean that the collection itself is wet.
Exactly. Then there's class nominalism. This is similar, but it's a little more refined. It says that a property is a class of all the things that have that property.
Okay.
So the property redness is the class of all red things. Now, classes are usually treated as individuals, so this seems okay.
Right.
But there's a problem. You can have different properties that have the same instances.
Okay.
So imagine that all and only creatures with hearts also have kidneys.
Yeah.
Then the class of things with hearts would be identical to the class of things with kidneys.
Yeah.
But having a heart and having a kidney seem like different property.
Right. So just because they happen to be coextensive in the actual world doesn't mean that they're the same property?
Exactly. So how do we get around that? Well, some class nominalists have appealed to modal realism, which says that there are all these other possible worlds.
Oh, okay.
And so even if all the actual things with hearts have kidneys, there might be a possible world where that's not the case.
Yeah.
And so the property having a heart would be a different class from the property having a kidney because they would have different members in some other possible world.
So it seems like to fix this problem, you have to buy into a lot of other philosophical baggage, like a whole multiverse of other worlds.
Right. It gets complicated quickly.
Okay, what are some other views that don't require us to buy into all that?
Well, there's resemblance nominalism.
Okay.
This view flips the script. Instead of explaining resemblance in terms of shared properties, it explains properties in terms of resemblance.
Okay.
So things are red, not because they share the property redness, but because they resemble other red things. And resemblance is just taken to be a primitive relation. You don't have to explain it in terms of anything else. Now, you might worry that this makes our categories kind of subjective.
Yeah. Because it seems like what counts as resembling is going to depend on the person who's doing the judging.
Right.
And we want our categories to be objective.
Right. But resemblance nominalists will say that there are these objective patterns of resemblance out there in the world that ground our categories.
Okay.
And importantly, because resemblance is taken to be primitive, we don't get that infinite regress problem that we had with trope theory.
Right, because we're not trying to explain resemblance in terms of some other relation.
Exactly. But we do still have the problem of coextensive properties.
Yeah.
And so some resemblance nominalists will also appeal to modal realism. They'll say that even if two properties have the same members in the actual world, they might have different members in other possible worlds.
Okay, so modal realism seems to be a popular way to fix that problem.
Yeah, it is.
What's the last view that you wanted to talk about?
The last one is causal nominalism. This view tries to explain properties in terms of their causal roles. So to be soluble is not to have some property solubility. It's to be disposed to dissolve when placed in water.
Okay.
And this view has a certain appeal, right?
Yeah.
Because it grounds our properties in something observable, the causal interactions between things.
Yeah, it's very empirical.
It is. The problem, though, is that it's not entirely clear how you would give a completely nominalist account of what it means to have the same causal role.
Right.
It seems like you might need to appeal to some other nominalist theory, like trope theory or resemblance nominalism.
So it might just collapse into one of the other views.
It might.
Okay. So it seems like with all of these views, there's this constant tension between trying to account for what seems like real features of the world, but without appealing to anything beyond concrete particulars.
Right. And that's really the challenge of nominalism. And we see all these different ingenious strategies that philosophers have come up with to try to solve this problem.
Yeah, it's really impressive. Now let's move on to the second kind of nominalism. Nominalism about abstract objects. How do nominalists try to deal with things like propositions and possible worlds, which seem very important in philosophy?
Right. So nominalism about abstract objects is trying to avoid things that don't exist in space and time. And propositions, which are the things that are true or false, are often thought of as abstract objects.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about the proposition that snow is white, it doesn't seem like that proposition exists anywhere in space and time.
Exactly. And so the nominalist is either going to have to give a different account of what propositions are, or they're going to have to say that we don't need propositions at all.
Okay.
Now, some nominalists have tried to say that sets of concrete objects are themselves concrete, and so maybe we can think of propositions as sets of concrete objects. But then you have the problem of the empty set. The empty set has no members, and so it doesn't seem like it could be concrete. And you have the problem of propositions that are necessarily false. It doesn't seem like those could have any concrete grounding either.
Right.
Then there's some philosophers who say that propositions are these unstructured, primitive entities, but those are clearly abstract. So that's not going to work for the nominalist.
Okay. What about structured views of propositions, where the proposition is made up of other things, like objects and properties?
Right. So there's the Phrygian view, which says that propositions are made up of senses, which are these abstract entities that determine the reference of our words.
Yeah.
That's not going to work for the nominalist either.
Right. Because it's appealing to abstract objects.
Exactly. But then there's the Russellian view, which says that propositions are made up of the objects and properties themselves.
Okay.
So the proposition that Socrates is wise would be made up of Socrates, the property of being wise, and some relation of instantiation. Now, that might be okay for the nominalist if those things are concrete. But the question is, what is this structured entity, this proposition that's made up of those things?
Yeah.
Is it some kind of set? And if so, how do we give a nominalist account of sets?
Right. It seems like you're just pushing the problem back a step.
Yeah, that's right. So those are some of the challenges for giving a nominalist account of propositions.
Yeah.
But there are other strategies. Some nominalists will try to say that concrete things can play the role of propositions.
Okay.
So Quine, for a while, thought that we could just use eternal sentences. These are sentences that are true no matter what.
Okay.
But even sentence types, like the sentence, snow is white, might be thought of as abstract. So then some nominalists have said, okay, let's just use tokens. These are actual utterances or inscriptions. But then you have the problem that there are only finitely many tokens, but there might be infinitely many propositions.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So how can you get infinitely many propositions out of finitely many tokens?
Yeah, we can think about way more things than we can ever actually say.
Exactly. So that's a problem for that view. Then there are nominalists who will try to paraphrase sentences that seem to commit us to propositions.
Yeah.
They'll try to rewrite them in a way that only commits us to concrete objects.
Okay.
One example is inscriptionalism, which tries to rewrite sentences with that clauses in terms of concrete inscriptions. But again, you might worry that this is just pushing the problem back a step.
Yeah, you're just translating from one language that talks about propositions to another language that talks about propositions.
Right. It's not clear that you've really gotten rid of propositions.
Right.
And then there are some philosophers who just bite the bullet and say there are no propositions.
Okay.
This is the view called semantic fictionalism. And this view says that all our sentences about propositions are strictly speaking false, but they're useful fictions.
So it's okay to talk as if there are propositions, even though there really aren't.
Right. That's the view.
Okay, so those are some of the strategies for dealing with propositions. What about possible worlds? How do nominalists try to deal with those?
Yeah, so possible worlds are all the ways that reality could have been,
Okay.
and they're really important in philosophy. But a lot of philosophers think that they're abstract objects.
Right.
And so the nominalist has to find a way to either give a different account of what possible worlds are, or they have to say that we don't need possible worlds at all.
Okay.
So there are some actualists, philosophers, who think that only the actual world exists, who have tried to ground possible worlds in concrete reality.
All right.
Some have said that they're sets of space-time points,
Okay.
but that requires a nominalist account of sets and space-time points.
Right.
Others have said that they're thoughts in the mind of God.
Okay.
So if God is concrete, then maybe possible worlds can be concrete too.
Right.
But then you have to buy into the existence of God.
Yeah.
And then there's David Lewis, who was a modal realist.
Okay.
He says that possible worlds are just as real as our own world. They're just spatiotemporally isolated from us.
So there are all these other universes out there.
That's his view, yeah. It's a pretty radical view.
It is. What are some more moderate views?
Well, there's Armstrong's view. He says that possible worlds are just ways that the actual particulars and universals could be combined.
Okay.
So there aren't any merely possible worlds. There's just the actual world and all the ways that it could have been.
So it's a more economical view.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And then there's modal fictionalism, which is similar to semantic fictionalism.
Okay.
It says that we should talk about possible worlds as taking place within a fictional story.
So we can talk about possible worlds, but we don't have to believe that they really exist.
Right.
Okay, so it seems like with possible worlds, just like with propositions, there are all these different strategies that nominalists have come up with to try to account for them without appealing to abstract objects.
Yeah. And it's really remarkable how creative they've been.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, they're really pushing the boundaries of what's logically possible.
So to wrap up, the big question for nominalism is, can you really give a complete account of reality without appealing to abstract objects or universals? We've seen all these different attempts, but it's still an open question.
Right. And I think it really gets at this deep question about the relationship between our experience of the concrete world and our use of abstract concepts.
Yeah.
So for you, the listener, I'll leave you with this question. Is the appeal to abstract objects just a convenient fiction? Or is there something more to it? Is there something about the structure of our thought, or maybe even the structure of reality itself, that requires us to appeal to these abstract entities? I don't have the answer, but I think it's a question worth thinking about.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive on nominalism. I hope you found it as stimulating as I did. Until next time.